For 12 years, Frank had been the invisible man at St. Mary's Hospital. He collected parking fees, gave directions to lost visitors, and helped elderly patients to their cars. No one knew about the classified missions, the medal hidden in his dresser drawer, or the reason why he'd chosen to disappear into this quiet job. Until the night when domestic terrorists chose his hospital as their target, and Frank had to decide whether to stay hidden or become the warrior he'd once been. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden identity, sacrifice, and the warrior spirit that never dies, tell me in the comments where are you watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. St. Mary's Hospital had been Frank Coleman's world for 12 years. Not the inside. He'd only been past the lobby a handful of times. His domain was the parking lot, a sprawling maze of concrete and painted lines that stretched across 3 city blocks. From his small booth near the main entrance, Frank could see everything. At 64, Frank had the kind of face that people forgot immediately after meeting him. Average height, thinning gray hair, and weathered features that suggested a lifetime of outdoor work. He wore the same uniform every day, a blue windbreaker with St. Mary's parking services embroidered on the chest, khaki pants, and comfortable walking shoes. Most people barely noticed him. He was part of the scenery, like the streetlights or the emergency call boxes. Visitors would hand him their tickets, receive their validated parking passes, and drive away without a second glance. "Morning, Frank," Dr. Sarah Chen called out as she hurried past his booth, coffee cup in one hand, medical bag in the other. "Morning, Dr. Chen," Frank replied, raising his hand in a small wave. "Drive safe." This was his routine, had been for 12 years. He arrived at 6 a.m., opened his booth, and stayed until 10 p.m. when the night attendant took over. He knew every regular, every pattern, every unusual occurrence. It was a simple job that required no special skills, no background checks beyond the basic requirements, and no questions about what someone might have done before. That's exactly why Frank had chosen it. Around noon, Frank noticed a white van parked in the visitor section. It had been there for over 2 hours, which wasn't unusual. Families sometimes spent long periods at the hospital. But something about it caught his attention. The windows were tinted darker than normal, and it was parked in a spot that gave a clear view of the main entrance. Frank made a mental note and continued his rounds. It was during his afternoon walk that he noticed the second van. This one was blue, parked in the far corner near the emergency entrance. Like the white van, it had been there for hours. Frank approached it casually, pretending to check nearby meters. The van was empty, but he could see communication equipment mounted on the dashboard. The feeling in his gut grew stronger. Frank returned to his booth and did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The pages were filled with observations, patterns, and assessments, the kind of detailed surveillance notes that had once been second nature to him. He began to write. White van, visitor section, 2+ hours. Tinted windows, clear view of main entrance. Blue van, emergency lot, 1+ hours. Empty, comm equipment visible. Pattern suggests coordinated observation. At 3 p.m., Frank spotted a third vehicle, a black sedan with government plates parked in the staff lot. 3 men in suits got out and walked toward the hospital's administrative entrance. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the area with systematic attention. Frank's blood ran cold. After 12 years of anonymity, had they found him? But deep down, Frank knew this was something else. The warrior instincts that had kept him alive in 3 different war zones were screaming warnings. Something was wrong. Something was coming. And for the first time in 12 years, Frank Coleman began to prepare for war. At 8:47 p.m., Frank was preparing to close his booth when he noticed unusual activity near the main entrance. The white van had moved closer to the building, and he could see figures moving inside. The blue van had repositioned itself near the emergency entrance. Frank's training kicked in automatically. Multiple vehicles, coordinated positioning, extended observation period. This wasn't random. This was operational. As he watched, the side door of the white van slid open. 3 men in dark clothing emerged, moving with military precision toward the hospital entrance. Each carried a large duffel bag. Frank's blood turned to ice. He knew what was in those bags. He grabbed his radio and called hospital security. "This is Frank in parking. We have a situation at the main entrance. Multiple suspects with bags moving toward the building." But Frank knew it was too late. The men had already disappeared into the hospital. He watched as the blue van disgorged its own team. 4 more men, similarly dressed, heading for the emergency entrance. The first gunshots came at 8:52 p.m. Short, controlled bursts from automatic weapons. Professional work. His radio crackled. "All units, we have an active shooter situation. Hospital is in lockdown." Frank stood frozen for a moment, 12 years of civilian life warring with 3 decades of military training. He could walk away, call the police, and wait for professionals to handle it. But then he thought about Dr. Chen, about the construction workers who'd been so friendly, about the hundreds of patients and staff trapped inside with armed killers. Frank opened his booth storage locker and pulled out a small black bag he'd hoped never to use again. Inside were items he'd kept just in case: a tactical knife, night vision monocular, and a small device that could disable electronic locks. Frank moved toward the hospital with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years infiltrating enemy positions. The parking lot provided excellent cover: cars, concrete barriers, emergency call boxes. He used them all, approaching the building through blind spots and shadows. Inside, the hospital was chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow. Alarms blared constantly. Frank could hear shouting, crying, and occasional gunfire from deeper in the building. He moved through the corridors like a ghost, using skills he'd perfected in urban warfare. The layout was familiar. He'd walked these halls during his wife's final days, memorizing every turn, every exit, every potential hiding spot. Frank's first priority was intelligence. He found his answer in the main lobby, where one of the terrorists had set up a command post. The man was speaking into a radio, his back to Frank. Through the static, Frank could hear fragments: "First floor secured. Moving to second level. Civilian casualties minimal so far." Frank counted at least 7 voices on the radio. This was a large, well-coordinated operation. The terrorist never saw him coming. Frank's knife found the gap between the man's body armor and helmet with surgical precision. The kill was silent, professional, and over in seconds. Frank stripped the terrorist's equipment: radio, night vision, ammunition. The familiar weight of tactical gear felt strange after 12 years, but his muscle memory was intact. Frank keyed the radio, listening to the chatter. The terrorists were moving through the hospital methodically, securing each floor. Their objective was the intensive care unit on the 4th floor, specifically a high-value patient recovering from surgery. Frank's blood ran cold. Senator Patricia Walsh, chairwoman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She'd been admitted 3 days ago for emergency surgery, her presence kept strictly confidential. Somehow, these terrorists had found out. Frank began moving through the hospital with purpose. He wasn't just a parking attendant anymore. He was Sergeant First Class Franklin Cole, United States Army Special Forces, and he had a mission. The warrior had awakened. Frank moved through the hospital like a predator, using every lesson learned in 2 decades of special operations. The building's layout worked in his favor. He knew every corridor, every stairwell, every blind spot. He found the second terrorist on the stairwell leading to the 2nd floor. The man was providing overwatch, his rifle trained on the corridor below. Frank approached from above, using the shadows cast by the emergency lighting. The takedown was swift and silent. Frank's knife found the base of the man's skull with practiced precision. Another enemy eliminated, another weapon acquired. Frank now had an assault rifle, additional ammunition, and a clearer picture of the enemy's communications. He listened to their radio chatter, mapping their positions. 4 terrorists on the 2nd floor, 2 moving toward the 3rd, 1 remaining in the lobby. Frank descended the stairwell with ghost-like quiet. The terrorist in the lobby was positioned behind the reception desk, his rifle trained on the main entrance. He was expecting resistance from outside: police, SWAT teams, federal agents. He wasn't expecting an attack from within. Frank's approach was textbook special forces. He used the reflection in the lobby's glass doors to confirm the terrorist's position, then moved around the reception area's perimeter. The man never saw him coming. Frank moved through the 2nd floor with mechanical precision, using the terrorists' own radio to track their positions. 2 of them were clearing rooms systematically. Frank waited until they separated, then struck. The first terrorist was examining a supply closet when Frank's knife found his throat. The second one, alerted by the sound of his partner's death, turned just in time to see Frank's rifle muzzle pointed at his face. "Don't," Frank whispered. The terrorist's eyes widened as he took in Frank's appearance. This wasn't a panicked hospital employee. This was a professional, someone who moved and fought with lethal efficiency that only came from years of combat experience. The man reached for his radio, and Frank put him down with a single shot to the head. 4 down, 3 to go. Frank continued his ascent toward the 3rd floor, the hospital's surgical wing. He knew the layout intimately, having spent countless hours here during his wife's treatment. He found the 2 remaining terrorists positioned at either end of the hallway, their rifles trained on the stairwell entrances. They were expecting an assault from obvious approach routes. Frank gave them something unexpected. Using his maintenance access, he entered the ceiling through a utility panel. The hospital's infrastructure was designed for easy access to utilities. Frank crawled through the space above the suspended ceiling, moving with careful silence. He positioned himself directly above the first terrorist, then dropped through the ceiling tiles like a falling shadow. The man had perhaps half a second to register the threat before Frank's knife found his heart. The second terrorist, hearing the commotion, turned and fired wildly down the corridor. Frank was already moving, using the first terrorist's body as cover while he acquired the rifle. The firefight was brief and decisive. Frank's years of combat experience showed in every movement, every shot, every tactical decision. The terrorist was skilled, but he was facing a master. When the smoke cleared, Frank stood alone in the corridor. 6 terrorists eliminated, 1 remaining. The final terrorist was on the 4th floor, presumably holding Senator Walsh and the ICU staff hostage. Frank could hear him on the radio, calling for backup that would never come. Frank began his final ascent, moving toward the confrontation that would determine whether his 12 years of peaceful anonymity had been worth the cost. The 4th floor ICU was eerily quiet as Frank approached. He knew the layout perfectly. He'd walked these halls during his wife's final days. At the nurse's station, Frank found evidence of the final terrorist's passage. Medical charts were scattered across the floor, and there were signs of struggle. A chair was overturned, and drops of blood stained the linoleum. Through the radio chatter, Frank learned that the final terrorist had taken multiple hostages. Senator Walsh was his primary target, but he was also holding 3 nurses and a doctor. Frank keyed the terrorist's radio, using a dead man's call sign. "Alpha 6, this is Alpha 2. What's your status?" There was a pause. "Alpha 2, where the hell have you been? I've been calling for backup for 10 minutes. "Communications problems," Frank replied, disguising his voice. "I'm approaching your position now." "About time. I've got the package secured, but I need help moving her." Frank smiled grimly. The terrorist had just revealed his exact position and intentions. Frank positioned himself outside the ICU doors, using the reflection in the glass to assess the interior. The room was large, filled with medical equipment and hospital beds. He could see the terrorist near the far window, his rifle trained on hostages huddled in the corner. Senator Walsh was unconscious in the bed closest to the terrorist, connected to multiple monitors and IV lines. She was completely vulnerable. Frank had one advantage. The terrorist was expecting backup, not an assault. Using his radio, Frank called out, "Alpha 6, I'm coming through the doors. Don't shoot." "Copy that, Alpha 2. Jesus, what took you so long?" Frank burst through the doors with the fluid grace of a special forces operator. For a split second, the terrorist saw what he expected, a team member in tactical gear. By the time he realized his mistake, Frank was already moving. The terrorist swung his rifle around, but Frank was faster. 25 years of Green Beret training gave him the edge he needed. Frank's first shot took the terrorist in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot was to the chest, punching through body armor with precision. The terrorist stumbled backward, his rifle clattering to the floor. Frank was already closing the distance before the man could recover. "Please," the terrorist gasped, blood frothing from his mouth. "Don't." Frank's knife found his throat, ending the plea and the threat simultaneously. The ICU fell silent except for the steady beeping of medical equipment and quiet sobs of the hostages. "It's over," Frank said quietly. "You're safe now." Dr. Martinez, the ICU attending physician, stepped forward cautiously. "Are you Are you police? Frank looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. I'm the parking lot attendant. The doctor's eyes widened in disbelief. You're Frank? The guy who works in the booth? Yeah, Frank replied, already stripping off the tactical gear. That's exactly who I am. 3 days after the incident, Frank returned to his booth in the hospital parking lot. The physical evidence of the attack had been cleaned up, but emotional scars remained. Extra security guards patrolled the grounds and staff members moved with hypervigilance. Frank resumed his routine as if nothing had happened. He collected parking fees, gave directions to visitors, and helped elderly patients to their cars. To anyone watching, he was the same quiet, unremarkable man he'd always been. But those who'd been in the ICU that night looked at him differently. Dr. Martinez nodded respectfully when he passed. The nurses who'd been held hostage always made time to chat. They knew what he'd done, even if they didn't understand how. Frank was fine with that. He'd saved lives, protected innocent people, and eliminated a threat. That was enough. On his 4th day back, Frank noticed a black sedan parked in the visitor lot. 2 men in suits sat inside, watching his booth with professional interest. Federal agents, probably. Frank had been expecting them. The sedan left after 6 hours without making contact. Frank wasn't surprised. They would have run every check on Franklin Cole, parking lot attendant. They would have found exactly what he'd wanted them to find: a quiet, unremarkable man with no criminal record. They wouldn't find Sergeant First Class Franklin Cole, United States Army Special Forces. That man had ceased to exist 12 years ago, buried beneath layers of false documentation and carefully constructed anonymity. Frank intended to keep it that way. As the sun set over the hospital parking lot, Frank prepared to close his booth for the night. Tomorrow would bring another day of collecting parking fees and giving directions. The day after that would be the same. And if another threat emerged, if innocent people were in danger again, Frank would be ready. Because some warriors never truly retire. They just wait in the shadows, watching over the people they've sworn to protect, ready to step forward when darkness threatens the light. Frank Coleman, parking lot attendant, understood that better than most. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone who seemed ordinary until the moment they revealed their extraordinary past? Share their story in the comments below and let us know what city you're watching from today. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button to help us honor the hidden heroes who walk among us every day. Thank you for watching The Human Stories, and we'll see you in the next one.